Hello. Hey, folks. Can people hear me okay? I'm like using this mic situation for the first time. Thumbs up, people in the back. Cool. Hey. Yeah, so like Aaron, Pete, and I mentioned previously that Josh is out of town, and while he's out of town, he gave us an opportunity to talk to you guys about a few different options. And I realized that I actually never really had an opportunity to like properly introduce myself to you guys because I started being a TA late. So hi, we're like most of the way through class. Nice to like meet all of you properly. My name's Ryan. I'm a PhD student in the English literature department, which might be kind of funny, like what's an English literature person doing, like TAing a programming class. But I have a master's degree in game design, and my primary research area of interest is game studies, which is like a humanities field that's kind of a sect of media studies interested in games as a site of culture. And I don't just write about games or think about games abstractly, I make them. I have a small game company in Denmark where I did my master's program. It's called Autoscopia Interactive. We're making a game that was a Independent Games Festival nominee in 2020. Got some funding to develop it into something bigger. It's called Forgotten, if anybody cares about that. But as somebody that's interested in like the kind of cultural significance of games and also sort of someone who thinks about them as a craft, one of the sort of like, I guess you could call it like, it's not so secret anymore, but like the secret sauce, I think, of a lot of game development is what's loosely referred to as game feel. Has anybody ever heard this term before? People who maybe just like playing video games? Game feel? Okay, it's like a minority of students in the class. That's cool. So this will, I hope, be an interesting opportunity for folks because like, even though a lot of the examples I'm going to be talking about aren't things in processing, I do have like an example in processing. And as you guys are making your final projects, if you want to like add like an extra dimension of, fun and intrigue to them, game feel will be like a useful tool in your toolkit, especially if you're somebody that maybe wants to make games one day. If you're not already, for that matter. So, will it work if I do this? Cool. So who here has played Super Smash Bros? All right, that's what I thought. All right. So I'm curious of the folks who had their hands up. You there with the beanie. What's your favorite character to play?
Probably Kirby.
Kirby? All right, cool. What's your favorite move to do as Kirby?
Oh my, I don't remember.
Can you think of one?
Because I haven't played it in a while, but
Yeah.
probably like the float is good.
The float is good.
It prevents
Yeah.
you from falling off the platform.
Yeah. How does it feel to float as Kirby? Do you remember? Can you describe it?
Oh my god.
It's really hard to describe sensations, but you know what I'm talking about, right? Like when I say, do you know how it feels to float as Kirby? You know what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Maybe it's a little bit bouncy.
A little bit, yeah. Because it's like you have to constantly press the button.
Yeah. Because you have to press the button and then it keeps staying in the air. I'm just repeating what you say so that people who are hearing the recording can hear me. Yeah. Let's see. Rebecca, who's in my other class too, I saw that you had your hand up. What's your favorite Smash Bros. Character?
Well, I have three.
Great. Which one? Pick one.
Inkling.
Oh, is that from Ultimate?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what's your favorite move as that character?
Honestly, I'm not very good at playing that character. I just like going in the paint and then like dashing around really fast.
You like dashing around, right? How would you describe that dashing around feeling?
I don't know. It's kind of like slippery.
It's slippery.
It's like really fast.
What makes it slippery, do you think? What's that mean?
It's like because when you're in the paint and you're like sprinting, and
Yeah.
then you change directions, it like overshoots a little, and then you like kind of go back.
Right, so the character has momentum, and there's paint on the ground, right? And the momentum for the character, because there's paint on the ground, like keeps going as you're like maybe start pulling the character in the opposite direction. So it's like there's this kind of like slipping on a banana peel kind of effect, right? Has everybody ever thought for a minute about how weird that is? That we have sensations from playing video. Like it's weird, right? Like when in your everyday life do your actions have that kind of sensation? Like when you're normally just acting with your body in meat space, like certainly there's like feelings in your body, right? But like that kind of palpable effect is kind of strange. And it's not the kind of thing you necessarily get in movies, necessarily. It's not the kind of thing you'd get in like any kind of non-interactive medium. It requires the like ability to gear into with your actions some kind of interface and get feedback on your actions, and then your brain produces like weird sensations, right? So game feel is pretty much the craft of that. And I call it a craft because like it's a practice and it's not. There's definitely going to be like math and like there's something of a science to it, but it's really not a strict science because it's fundamentally creative. And I think it's really the site where y'all who are like learning how to program, most of you for the first time, I think maybe like we can take a step back from the like formal number crunching and figuring out like how to even make a thing compile or whatever, and like maybe think a little bit more as like creatives and think about what kinds of experiences we might want to like put into the bodies of the folks that are like playing our stuff or interacting with our art, right? So, so this talk is heavily. So this talk is game feel is a like concept that's coined by a game designer named Steve Swink. It's a great book. It's kind of like canonical, I think, in like game design spaces. I've read most of it. Most people who are like in any kind of design arena of like making games totally have to read chunks of this book. And honestly, it's wonderful because it's like the first text to really articulate something important about like this area of the craft of game design, the like sensations that we have while we're playing games. It's also really old, and so I kind of wish that somebody would kind of come in and do like a 2.0 of like game feel, maybe with something that involves VR or mixed reality or something. But we'll have to wait for that. So basically, there's a certain kind of structure or like various kinds of games that we can think of that involve like different arenas of sensation for what you're trying to go for. And this doesn't necessarily need to just apply to games. It really can apply to like other kinds of interactive art. But roughly speaking, 10 frames per second is kind of the rate at which people can perceive some sort of change. There's like a lower level threshold at which like if something's moving too fast, our eye just doesn't really pick it up. So yeah, like images that are displayed at a rate faster than one cycle of human perceptual processing can end up being closer to like 50 to 200 milliseconds. And so images that are displayed at a rate at or above 10 frames per second will kind of fuse into motion, if you will. We sort of perceive it as like an ongoing image, like one object that's moving around instead of like a series of static images. And film, of course, works like this too. Like that's sort of the behavior of film as a series of images just sort of like strung together really quickly. So we perceive them as like one continuous kind of motion. So yeah, there's this like, basically games are a way, or one of many ways, of situating people in what's called a human-computer interaction loop. Human-computer interaction is an entire like school of research in stuff that's in the direction of computer science, but it's primarily interested in how people like gear into technology so they can be used in ways that are productive. Like the loop of being in a machine doesn't necessarily even need to be digital, right? Like the design of like driving a car would need similar kinds of thinking. But certainly when it comes to the like feedback cycle of how a computer or like these sort of dynamic interacting moving images like make meaning for us, like how we even understand that we can control an avatar by like messing with it and getting feedback from it, all of this kind of has to do with this loop where we have like an ability to receive sensory input from the world, and in this case from like the images on a computer. We'll sort of process that, and before we're not even aware at like between steps like 2 and 3, like all of how our body's reacting to it, but our muscles have a reaction time for when we're responding to like a stimulus, right? And then like if we kind of cross over from the human bit to the computer bit of this chart, we'll sort of start thinking more about like granularly how the design of the things that we're making like are sort of meant to kind of fit neatly onto like human cognition or to the structure of how people think about actions and the embodiment of their actions. So the things that we start into thinking about as designers are things in the direction of controller input, how the hardware is processing the information that we have. Like we've all had to deal with that in terms of writing. Literally like the order of your code sometimes in processing is going to like matter, right? Like sometimes you need your background to refresh at one time versus like another if you want certain objects you're drawing to be visible, right? So we already have to think about the way that the machine is processing the information, not necessarily because like the computer is going to be confused, but because we, like in terms of what kind of feedback we're getting, need to have things operating in a certain way to have the experience we want people to have. all of this will render visually for us, and from that we can respond to it. And so this is sort of like the big loop of human-computer interaction with games. And as somebody who's trained in like a few different discourses, like I have this kind of funny, weird mixed background studying literature, philosophy, game design, media studies. I actually think this is kind of profound. Like the way that we're able to use computers to like basically enable ourselves to have what I think is kind of like a different or even kind of an aesthetic appreciation of our actions. Like having even just like the springiness of Mario's jump, which is something we're going to talk about later. Like the fact that even can be fun, I think sort of tells us something interesting about the human mind and our relationship to action. So all of this stuff about the way that we're going to be thinking about like designing mediated action, designing input, feedback in our processing programs in games that we might make. The thing about this is that all of this is gearing into parts of the body that like have been around for like a very long time. And so the good news is that there's stuff about our perceptual field and about the kind of like intent people bring into when they're trying to play games that we can kind of calculate and solve in terms of like how quickly people process information. So yeah, like part of the point that I'm kind of interested in making with these charts that are from Swink's book are that player cognition is just really tightly bound to the responsiveness of our programs. Thinking it through like this loop between like the physical space and like what's happening on the back end of the computer and then how that stuff is rendered, Swink kind of walks us through a series of strategies for what to think about as designers like at every level of this interaction loop, right? So we're going to talk a little bit today about like the different kinds of physical affordances, starting at number 1 down here with input, like the different kinds of physical affordances that like controllers have and what even kinds of movement are maybe even possible with like depending on our controller setup. If you're working with a joystick, it'll behave and feel really differently than if you're working with like WASD or up, down, left, right on a keyboard, or for that matter, even if you have like a directional pad, like all of those things behave mechanically differently. Going over like to number 2, response, kind of thinking about how the game responds to input, like not even getting to people yet, but just like how exactly are you implementing the way that this like kind of input can get rendered by the computer, and like what order of structuring your code do you need to have the kind of responsiveness that you want. All of this then is sort of in service of number 3, content, right? This sense of a game world or a sense of simulated space or simulated movement, which is undergirded by 4 rules. And not all rules necessarily are like granularly about how things are encoded line by line in the program, right? Like game rules can sometimes be like a little bit more social or like higher level than just like singular lines of code. But all of these coalesce together in the experience of playing the game. Players don't need necessarily to know how something is implemented for it to have like various kinds of effects on them. 5 is polish. Polish, I think, is actually simultaneously the most important and also like least developed, or at least like less specific idea in Swink's book. Polish is like multiple things. It's a phase of development in game design. Like if you ever make games, you don't start by trying to make something feel exactly how you want it to be like at the end of the project. You need to start by just kind of laying out the architecture for what you want and, kind of testing and experimenting from there for yourself until it like feels right. And this iterative process is very loosely referred to as polish in Swink's book. And it's like, it ultimately comes down to like, this is where it sort of stops being a science and starts being an art. Like you needing to kind of play around with the values of what you've made in an experimental way and maybe test it with other people until you're kind of getting the effects that you want. And so 6, metaphor, is kind of like, I think the sort of bigger holistic way that we take in when we kind of have like, when we're players playing like, in a game world, playing Breath of the Wild or something, we don't perceive, a complex system of like rules or even like individuated, like frame by frame scenes, right? We have this whole sense of like a game world and a space we can explore. And so metaphor is like really central. The fact that our minds can do this kind of like reaching across the sort of virtual gap between ourselves and the machine, that all coalesces into this sense of like being in a game, right? Like being immersed in it. So, as people who make things, perception and motion really are kind of the clay that we're sculpting. And the differences between frames per second are the material that we're using to do so. So frames per second really are kind of like the core of game feel. Like this is the site of having the kind of differences that you want if you want your character to feel slippery, if you want your character to feel heavy or what have you. So yeah, let's get into a little bit of like thinking concretely about numbers. So when you're thinking about implementing movement, it's helpful to know like literally how quickly like the mind processes movement. There are perceptual, cognitive, and motor responses to an input in a quarter of a second of our neural systems, which sends information to our muscles for us to respond to input. And usually this isn't even like a wholly conscious process. We don't need to think terribly hard about how we react to a stimulus in the world. You know, if you're driving and somebody cuts you off, you don't think, you react, right? We're really kind of built as very complicated pattern matching animals to be able to like not necessarily need to be aware of all of our actions. And this becomes relevant really apparently when you start trying to make anything for anybody to use in a sensible way with a computer. So yeah, like here's a kind of funny example that from Josh's slides that I liked a lot. Let's say that you have an intent to grab a muffin. At the early stages of that reach, you're not even probably really thinking about, you're not thinking too hard about like how to move your arm. Your arm is probably just moving. As you get closer to your goal of grabbing and eating the muffin, you need to like extend your fingers a little bit more, like with a little bit more dexterity around this thing. It requires a little bit more awareness. And the reason why this is interesting is because it tells us something about how long it kind of takes for people to become like aware or even paying attention to their actions. Some stuff happens behind the scenes of our perception, and some stuff is a little bit more foregrounded. And so I think something that's really interesting when you start kind of mediating people's actions on a screen is that, kind of like I was saying earlier, I think there's a lot of different ways that games like enable our actions to become more sensible. Anybody play any VR? Like anybody actually have a headset for virtual reality? Yeah, a few people. It's unfortunately like not very accessible. Has anybody heard of or played Half-Life Alyx? It's like one of those things that's kind of considered like a quote unquote killer app. Half-Life being like a really popular first-person shooter that's been around for decades at this point. And Half-Life Alyx is the first in the series to come out in like a long, long time, and it's this like complicated VR game, and it's pretty innovative for a few reasons. I have this like my theory about like what Valve, the company, is doing with Half-Life is like every time the world needs to learn how to make a first-person shooter because there's a new medium to make it in, Valve makes a Half-Life game. So there's this interesting beginning to Half-Life Alyx where there's all this stuff like around the space, and like there's even like you literally can pick up what are they called, like expo marker kind of things, and like draw on windows, and it just works. Like they've set it up so that without needing to think too hard about it, because the mechanism that you're using in like one of these devices has like a kind of trigger on it. When you hold down the trigger, that's like your hand is grabbing onto something. So there's this kind of like mapping between what we normally do when we grab stuff in meat space and how like grabbing stuff in virtual space is being simulated here. And so it's really intuitive just to pick stuff up, and then you just kind of like, you're like, oh my God, it's gonna work. And you start drawing on the window and you're like, oh my God, it just works. Like you can just draw like whatever with it. This is a screenshot of a professor teaching a math class over Zoom using Half-Life Alyx, which I thought was kind of funny. But when I first played Half-Life Alyx, I had this funny experience happen to me where there was a watering can. And the watering can was kind of big. It's like just one of those objects that's on like a balcony at the beginning of the game. I wish I could find a screenshot of that. I don't own the game, so I couldn't like take a screenshot for this. But I just kind of went down to pick it up. And you guys know watering cans, right? Like they're kind of bulky. And so like I picked it up and I noticed that the delay, like a very small delay about how like the object had like a sense of give to it, I swear to God, my brain like papered over some of the gaps, and it kind of felt like I was picking up an object that had weight. And I could tell that wasn't true, but the point is that the overlap of interaction and like visual response was so closely tied that like literally there's some bits of like my, you know, mirror neurons or whatever that like papered in detail for me that was entirely based on the input, but or like the relationship between my actions and the visual feedback I was getting. And part of why that was is like, if I was tilting the watering can, it wasn't like sticking really directly to my hand movement, you know? It had some give to it. Like it kind of felt like a thing that had weight. You know, like if you're picking up something that's heavy, it takes a little bit of effort for you to like heft it. They were able to actually kind of get something like that going on with different objects in the game. And that's game feel. Like that's a sort of weird example of VR game feel. So yeah, let's talk a little bit more about the kind of thing that we would be doing if we were making games that have game feel, thinking about more like side scrollers or relatively simple, you know, like arcadey kinds of games, stuff that's maybe more in our wheelhouse. So like I mentioned earlier, like the way animation works is that there's these repeated series of images, right? And the images are closely bound enough together that they have the perception of continuous movement. The magic number that most people have is like 10 pictures or 10 frames per second before our brain can pick up movement, which will be important information for you when you're trying to figure out like what is considered responsive in your implementation of things. And so I think to tie this into processing, this is kind of why we have to refresh that background in processing when we're making continuous movement, right? Because that's sort of in the way that like a film or you know an OG film, non-digital films, like had just kind of small pictures in sequence and you ran them through a projector really quickly. We kind of have to like color over by refreshing the background every frame, every time we're drawing a, you know, whatever it is that we're moving, so that it has this like sense of continuous movement. The way I think about it is the good news is that like our monkey brains are very old and thankfully not changing too fast, and our technology is moving very quickly, but we keep finding like more or less the same strategies for how to get the same kinds of like illusions that we want. So in some ways we're kind of tapping into this interesting older history of moving images when we're making games and processing. It's all kind of the same strategy. So yeah, so like here's kind of a gap, or like in terms of like timing of a movement, like to sort of think about when and how movements start having different kinds of sensations. So something within the 0 to 100 millisecond range is considered to be like really responsive or even instant. Like your brain might not, kind of like I said a minute ago with that watering can example, if the watering can was too closely mapped to like my hand movement, it would feel twitchy. You know what I mean? If you guys ever play a first-person shooter game and the like mouse sensitivity is like really high to the point where you can barely control what's going on, that has a feeling, right? It's not a very good feeling. Things that are kind of beneath this threshold will like map very, very, very closely onto your input. But there's a sweet spot, because if you even go like a few more milliseconds into the future, like upwards of 200 milliseconds, you might start feeling things that the sensational response you might have to that is that what you're feeling is kind of sluggish. There's this kind of like magic sweet spot in between these thresholds. And basically, I think this is when the frame rate starts chugging and we get kind of at or past the 200 millisecond mark. This is when things start to feel kind of broken, you know, like a frame rate dip of some sort. So yeah, there's lots we can think of, and maybe I'll even break it open into conversation briefly about it. There's lots of examples I think we can think of about like games that have interesting or like useful game feel. One of them that's like historically important is the first Prince of Persia game, which is kind of a classic example to think about in design spaces with frame rate. The hopping animation in this game, the ducking animation in this game was 4 frames. Only 4 frames, and it took 150 milliseconds to complete. And based on that chart that I showed you earlier, you might think that's like pretty slow. But for this relatively simple like execution of this kind of movement that it was doing, it ended up like making this particular maneuver in the game useful. Sometimes we want to strategically have slower animations. Why might that be? Anybody familiar with the phrase animation lock? Is this a thing anybody has kind of come across in like game design circles? One person. Can you actually explain it to us briefly? No, it's okay. I'm just kind of curious.
It's just basically like when your character has to complete an animation before you can do more stuff.
Exactly. It's when the character has to finish having an animation before like the game allows or the system allows input to be read again. One of my favorite games is Dark Souls, like pretty much everybody in like my generation of players, I feel like. But one of the things that Dark Souls is kind of infamous for is that when you press the attack button, you have like very much committed to the attack. Like with most games that are kind of like, I don't know, if you've ever played like a Devil May Cry or like a God of War kind of game, you press a button and like immediately your character does something. Not the case in Dark Souls. You press a button to attack and there's this whole ass wind up that like takes a lot of time for you to actually pull off the maneuver. But the reason why this ends up being interesting for players is that while they're like committed to that attack, it means that you force players to think like a little bit fourth dimensionally. Like players have to think a few seconds in the future and kind of metagame, if you will, like with the game system to sort of plan out when they're going to attack. So animation lock, having intentionally somewhat slower animations strategically, is actually like not necessarily a bad thing per se. It's like a useful tool in our tool belt as people that are interested in making things with computers and making more creative work. Yeah, so we're going to kind of talk about different like material inputs. This is something that I think is like really interesting to think about because like, again, the body is involved in our design process, right? Like the physicality of what kind of inputs we're using is going to affect like the implementation process, like down to exactly how and when we want movement to happen, what kinds of inputs we want to be allowed when. So Mario's movement is like famous as just a classic example for this because it's so like accessible and so proliferated. So Mario's avatar, if you notice, like try to like paper over your mind like Mario's like animations for a second, like the actual movement that the avatar is doing, and just think of him as like a little box. Look at the way that the box is kind of like sliding and moving back and forth, or like how exactly it's like jumping up in the air and such. And you might notice that there's like a very small gap between when the box starts moving in the direction that the designers like want Mario to start moving, or when the player even starts wanting Mario to move in a different direction, and when the box actually starts moving, like Mario, the like avatar actually changes position. But what's immediate, what happens like clearly like as soon as possible, with probably within that 10 frame gap that we were talking about earlier, where something's barely even perceivable, the picture that's displayed, that's like which direction Mario is facing, whether or not he's jumping, like these different visual representations of like his character, that's happening immediately. So this is interesting because it ends up kind of revealing the nuance of how to make something that has the sort of like pleasure that Mario's movements and jumps have. It's important for players to have enough feedback from the system when, like, if Mario wants to change direction and we flip from left to right, that has to happen immediately because that part is essential for players to know that they're actually getting accurate feedback from the system. If we didn't have that, we might be tempted to think, or some people, might kind of think, like for a second, is this like, am I getting the response that I want? Might like tap the button more than once. But getting that visual feedback change really quickly on how, like what direction the like avatar's movement is happening, that allows people to like have the security and like know that there's no like anxiety about whether or not their input is being read. The fact that that's not where like the actual movement starts happening means that that's part of this is sort of like within the threshold of what allows Mario's movement to not feel twitchy and to feel kind of pleasurably bouncy. So yeah, I think that this is sort of a subtle but very interesting way that Mario's implemented. You can kind of see with the vertical lines on the screen also there's a little bit of give about like when the camera starts moving forward. But we can think of different ways to implement this, right? Like let's imagine for a second that in the first draft of Mario, Miyamoto just had the camera like stay exactly on the axis that Mario was on. Like when we have this parallax view in the background, it's following Mario like exactly pixel by pixel, like where he is in space. Can people imagine with me, like what would that feel like? Anybody have thoughts? What would it feel like for a avatar to like totally map one-to-one onto like a parallax movement like this? Anybody? Yeah.
I feel like
always moving with the character, then you're always moving.
Yeah, maybe. Like if you're always moving, then it might be kind of like dizzying or disorienting, or like it could just feel like you have kind of too much control over the camera. What's that about? Anybody have thoughts about that? Like how can something have too much control over the camera? Like you're getting feedback on, you want to know where the avatar is, right? Like that's kind of a weird effect. Yeah, what do you think?
Well, at least from how I'm understanding your explanation,
Yeah.
I feel like it would take away from you being able to just assess the environment.
Okay, yeah, it might take away from being able to assess the environment. Yeah.
And then just not only if someone feels dizzy, it makes it less accessible to people.
There's an access consideration too. Yeah, that's really interesting.
And then also like for me, I'd also feel like rigid
Rigid.
and like
Yeah.
kind of stiff, and that is not a comfortable position to be in if you're trying to play, especially if you're binging.
Yeah, especially if you're binging, especially if you've been playing Mario for 8 hours straight, right? Yeah, rigid is a really interesting word for it. Like, there's almost, it would, like, if you've ever had to kind of like hold your posture for longer than is comfortable, or like, you know, your dog is sleeping on your arm or something and you can't move your arm you can't move the arm away because that would make the dog, or cat or what have you. That kind of, it's interesting that that's the kind of language that comes to mind, but I know what you mean when you say that. And the fact that we can even have like a coherent conversation about this is sort of interesting. It speaks to how there's something low level about the way that our mind like interprets movement that's like relatively shared, not universally shared. People have all sorts of like different ways that the brain, you know, is shaped and operates, but very loosely we can kind of coherently know in our design principles like how people are going to respond to different movement. What's up, Rebecca?
Kind of like with the camera panning and also like the like small delay when Mario turns. It kind of to me is sort of just reflecting what is most natural because it could like immediately respond to every input, and it could like follow the like screen could move every time it moves. But like I'm trying to like I was kind of thinking like in comparison to the real world, like when you're watching someone walk past you, you're not turning your head to like slowly follow them at a good like a pace. Sometimes you like stop moving and just like track them with your eyes, which
Yeah.
is kind of the same thing as what is happening with this. It's like if you're like too particular with like the movement and have every response be immediate, then it feels like too artificial almost. And
Yeah.
when it's too artificial, it's too difficult to like track in your like natural human brain.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's an awesome explanation. Just to repeat it for the people who like might be listening to the recording. Yeah, it's really interesting to think about how like if you're watching somebody in meat space and they're walking by, you're not like laser locked onto their movement in some twitch way, right? There's like this natural way that we relate spatially to something that's moving in the world. And so the camera has to like emulate that behavior in order for this to feel quote unquote natural. Do you have something you want to say?
Yeah, I feel like it also would be a lot more awkward too if it was constantly following you.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah, it would feel
certain
awkward
jumping
otherwise.
actions,
Mhm.
It's kind of like when he jumps on the blocks right here and then he
Yeah.
jumps to the stairs. Like it stops for a second, so it's like okay, I can assess. Like I need to get some momentum going, then I can
Yes.
jump.
Yes.
And if I was just like constantly moving with the screen, it would make it awkward. I'd miss the step. It would make it a little bit frustrating to try and complete something that should be pretty easy and overcomable.
Yeah.
In the game.
Yeah, that's an awesome observation. That like if we're trying to, because with games we kind of have to. I mean, even just being in the world, right? Like walking around, we have to predict like the effect that our actions are going to have on an environment. And so, in order to like know whether or not we're going to clear that gap that Mario's jumping between here, we have to have some sense of being able to like tell how far away it is. And if there was constant movement, then we wouldn't be able to have that discernment. So yeah, there's all sorts of interesting and practical reasons why like this has to be the way that it is. And the only thing that I'm trying to point out to you, because when you look at it, it feels obvious. Like if you're not thinking like a designer, you're like, well, yeah, this is just how you make stuff. This is obvious. This is intuitively how like vision and perception work. But it's not to a computer, right? Like these are things we have to tell it explicitly because a computer does not know what it's like to have a body like experiencing movement. Everything has to be like prescribed, which means that we have to like actually unpack how it is that these things are even natural to us and like give it that information so that it can mediate movement in a way that makes sense to our brains. So yeah, like I kind of want to think about mapping some of the example of Mario's movement into the context of like these 6 principles that Swink discusses as being relevant to game feel. You know, at the input level, there's like these physical properties, there's the human device, how many and what kinds of input, right? These are all factors. In terms of number 2, response, there's how the game actually responds to the input. We were kind of talking a minute ago about how this parallaxed view isn't, I think that's probably a good example of what we were just talking about, like when it would feel too rigid otherwise, if we implemented the movement differently and the camera relationship differently. And so number 3, context, like this notion that there's a game world or a space. Like I think the background of what's going on in Mario might actually in some ways be like just as important as the foreground, like what objects you can jump on to get the player to interpret and understand like what their relationships or distance between objects are, or like what even are actions that are afforded in the environment. And then number 4, rules, you know, there are these kind of arbitrary relationships between objects that aren't necessarily always encoded in like the movement per se. Like Mario needs to know when he like hits the flower or like a power up to then like create some kind of game state change. And that's not necessarily movement, but the fact that it's spatialized like in an object, that like having like changes to like a thing that's interesting you could do for your final projects, for instance, is like come up with ways that you could like change the game state based on like, I don't know, if you have a character slipping around in mud, maybe the character could like move differently. Or if you have a power up that allows your character to fly temporarily, that might change the behavior of a jump or what have you. Polish, as I've kind of said, is sort of like just the iterative process of like you need to just test out tweaking parameters. And I'm going to show you an example in processing in a little bit about a good way to structure your code if you were interested in making this kind of thing, so that you can have easy, very visible and accessible parameters to tweak, because like you're not going to get it right on the first time. You don't want to hard code your variables. You want to be able to like have information about how fast movement works or how intense gravity is or how much friction you want on the ground or whatever, so that you can like play around with it until it feels good for you. And overall, number 6, metaphor, players are just going to interpret this as a guy walking around a fantasy world, right? Like it's all going to kind of come together in their perception to be one coherent thing. I think it's interesting, actually, that we're so closely cognitively tied to movement in games that we unproblematically just say that we are Mario. Like I picked up the flower, I jumped over the, like the gap between the platform and like where I was trying to get to. It's interesting, I think, how like, and this is kind of where I get what I meant earlier, but I actually think that games kind of can have this kind of profound impact on identity because of this stuff. Like games literally allow us to experiment a little bit through kind of shaping our actions or like prescribing certain kinds of actions, what it might be like to kind of hold a different kind of sense of self. And I just think it's really interesting that computers can even give us something so intimate. And I do think that game feel and like the loop of human-computer interaction are like really core principles for any of that to be possible. So yeah, I want to show a little video. This is kind of famous in game circles. It's called Juice It or Lose It. We won't watch like all of it, but I'll show you guys a little bit of it. This example doesn't necessarily involve movement, but it really intuitively showcases how like responsiveness to animations can just completely change the feeling of a game. So let me see if I can get this working in a different browser. One second.
Here in this demo. But basically tweening in the world of computers means that you provide a start point, say 1, and you provide an end point, say 11. And you say, I want it to take this long and use this equation to get there. And you can use this for a bunch of properties. And you can't always use a tweening engine. There are times when it's not appropriate or you're lazy or whatever, but you can always use this baby right here. Does this make sense to you at all?
Where X is like the X position.
Good. Basically, we're moving X, whatever value that is, 10% of the way we need to go. So at first it will go fast, and then as it approaches its target, it will slow down. Looks very nice. They're easy to implement like this. Have it run every frame. You're good. But we're going to do some proper tweening in this game. And a good place to do tweening is when these blocks appear on the screen. We want to make it look juicy and nice. So we're going to start by tweening their position, as my assistant here will show you. So as he resets the level, they sort of fall in instead. And now we can use these mystical equations here. So instead of using the linear one, which is just falling in, we can use this sort of slow down type equation. it's slowing down slightly. We can do better though. We can go slightly past our target using a different equation. Look at that, very luxurious. And there's also crazy equations. You're laughing, this is serious stuff. And the bouncing equation, this is a crazy one. Look at it, amazing. And we can also tween other properties, that not just position, we can tween rotation, and we can tween scaling. Let's try that, see what happens. Very nice. You see, it's getting somewhere. And the best thing we can do is add a little bit of delay, a random delay to everything. Looks like this. Look at that. Same thing. We're not changing the game at all.
So unlike easing and tweening, squeezing and stretching is an actual programming term that you can't Google, but this is a term we came up with for a bunch of different effects you can add to your game that make things way better. Some of these are done with tweening and easing, or most of these are done with tweening and easing. So we're going to start out with making the paddle respond a bit.
Stretchy paddle.
So instead of, this isn't actually even using any kind of an easing, it's using the offset of the mouse pointer and where the paddle is to figure out a scale of X and Y. It's a very simple effect to implement. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to add some extra scaling to the ball. So when the ball hits something, it's going to scale up to bigger, and then it's going to go smaller with an easing equation.
You guys see that? With the
And
ball's
that looks
going
kind of nice. It
responding to
adds a
this.
bit of feel to the ball hitting things. Then we're going to make the ball rotate. So it's going to rotate in the direction that it's going. We're going to animate this rotation for a very small, subtle effect that's almost impossible to see. We're going to make also the ball stretch a bit. It's stretching based on its velocity. This looks way better if you have gravity, but it's okay with this. It also looks better if it's actually a ball-shaped thing.
Cool. I wonder if I can skip to the end here. They might not allow that.
We're going to animate.
Can I? Nope. All right, whatever. If people want to, this is like linked in the slides. That'll be sure. Are they available yet? Actually, my updated slides might not be. I'll make sure the slides are available for people to like peruse later, and then you can go watch the rest of this talk. It gets kind of crazy by the end. They've set up all these experimental parameters, and so by the end there's like fireworks and sound effects and like some screen shake. I think screen shake is actually like a really underrated way to think about like mediating movement. If people have ever played like Hotline Miami or something, that's a game where like as the character walks back and forth in an environment, the camera will kind of in this queasy way like tilt. Like in different directions, and that kind of gives you this sense of like weird, dreamy movement. Cool, yeah. So something that I think is actually, you know what? I'm going to actually I'm thinking that something concrete to play with will be useful before I get into input. Let me swap out into the example that RyanWright and I threw together last night. Thank you so much, RyanWright. So this is an example that people can find in the folder. It's called GameFeel example in the class folder and examples. So yeah, this is something that we played with yesterday. I'm realizing now that I'm going to have to like play on the big screen. This is going to be kind of awkward. Let me see. See if I can do this. Okay, is that? There we go. That's more visible. So here we have like a little square. It's in the bottom left. And I need to click into it because, there we go. Right, so we have this like squares movement, and you can jump with the W button. You can control with like S and D moving left and right. And look at that, right? He's bouncing, he's having a good time. But this is like, I don't know, how would you guys describe this kind of movement? Like, is this like super responsive? Does this feel really good? Like, how could we make it better? What do people think? What would people want out of this? It's really simple right now. Any intuitive thoughts about ways to make this a little juicier? Yeah, what do you think?
The movement's pretty soft.
Mm-hmm.
I guess. I like it for like, but I know that most people like more sharper movements.
Yeah, sharper movement could be good. It's totally depends on the game, right? Like there are some games where this, depending on the presentation, the world itself, this kind of movement might be totally adequate. But let's say we want something a little bit more responsive. What I mentioned earlier about like strategies for implementation, this is sort of an example of what I was talking about. Like RyanWright and I set it up so that there are all these like very easily tweakable parameters right at the top of the script, and these things influence how the player behaves. So let's say that we want to play around with speed. Let's double the speed. Let's make speed 10. See how that goes. All right. You can do what I want you to do? All right. Hey, look at that. It's a little bit sharper, right? It's like not nothing. But at least for me, like right now, I kind of feel like that now that we've made the movement a little bit faster, there's something about the jump that it's fine, but it's almost too slow for my tastes. Like, again, it depends on the kind of game you're making. But if I wanted the jump speed to be faster, maybe I could like match it. Let's actually triple it, see how that goes. I'm actually not sure how that'll play out here. Maybe this will be a little too wild. Let's see. Boing, boing. Right? You can hear the sound effects in your head with something like this, right? Like, I almost feel like that it's like palpable practically. I could see, like, let's say that we figured out a way to, like, I don't know, stretch the jump so that, like, our character has a little bit of, like, bounce to it. Like, all of a sudden there's personality in just a square, right? Like, if it's behaving in a certain way based on the movement. I wish we had some time last night to actually make that kind of thing happen, so you kind of see what I'm talking about a little more palpably. But do you kind of see what I mean, that based on the prior example, this feels springier because literally the response time is different. And then, just for laughs, something Arnpreet and I were laughing about that's like so simple but also so like easily easy to forget, because like the character's toward the bottom of the screen, that means that where the character is on the screen is like relatively low in the coordinate structure, right? If the character's hanging out in and around like the 600 mark on this like 800 by 800 screen that I drew. And so unintuitively, the jump height, while it looks like a really big number, 500, it's actually 500 is like actually kind of a low threshold. So we need to make this number lower if we want the jump to be higher, kind of unintuitively, just because of how the coordinate structure works in processing. Boing, boing, right? So now our guy can like jump to the moon. And it's interesting, I think, to consider how the height of the jump, this makes sense, of course, like when you think about it for 10 seconds, but it's interesting to think about how the height of the jump and the speed of the jump totally, like, it totally matters how you interpret how fast the jump is happening. Like, I didn't change how fast the jump was happening between the last time I played it and this time. What I changed was how high the jump is, and now I kind of feel like that relative to the last time, the jump is a little bit less responsive because the player is getting there a little slower, right? Because like the point it's trying to get to is further away. And you can play with this, right? You can have different kinds of values or different speeds for how fast the player jumps versus how fast the player falls, which is going to be the kind of thing we talk about next. Let me get out of this. And you can, of course, like play with this code, you know what I mean? Like feel free to like, if you want to like mess around with different parameters or try to add a sense of friction or slowness to the character, these are all things you can play around with. Can I get you to behave? Yes, cool. So I'm going to talk, oops. So like, I just think it's worth pointing out, based on the kind of material that you're using to play your game or what you're building, that like some, control schemes like literally have different afforded actions. Like on a directional pad, you can't press like left and right at the same time. You can't press up and down at the same time, but you can press, up and right at the same time or up and left or whatever, right? Like, so character movement, air control in jumping, that's like an afforded action that's like easier to do on like that kind of material. And meanwhile, like you would need to account as a programmer for what happens if you're playing on a computer and players like press both buttons at the same time. Like if you have some kind of complicated if, nested like if structure for when certain buttons like are pressed and how they respond, that's going to end up that the structure of what's drawn first or when certain things are triggered is going to matter for like when you have the ability to press multiple buttons at a time. And we can think about all sorts of stuff, right? Like the way that like circular movement is a little bit more intuitive with analog sticks. Some people like tend to prefer inverted axis movement for certain games. Like if I'm playing a game that's like in space where I have like a third person character or something, my intuition normally when I have a first person game is like that up should be up. But if I'm like driving the character from a third person perspective, I actually want down to be up. I want to kind of pull it like a camera, you know what I mean? So there's all sorts of like ways that we need to think about the context of what we're making, what kind of game we're going for, and how the player is going to interpret the sense of movement in the world when we're implementing a control scheme. And here at Davis, like over on like the far right, there's this kind of like question mark of what kinds of other inputs we could have. There's all sorts of interesting ways that we could like reimagine control schemes. Like if anyone here has had Patrick Lemieux as an instructor, he runs what's called the Alt Control Lab, and like there's this really interesting experiment that Patrick and other folks made called the Octopad, which is like it's a NES it's a NES playing Mario. But they're, instead of having like one gamepad, they've split. They distributed the NES controller across like 8 different gamepads, so it requires 8 different people who are all responsible for one button to like co-control Mario. So all of a sudden, this becomes this weird, socially interesting multiplayer game where you're kind of all collectively, you know, in your collective intelligence, are driving like one character, and it kind of produces this whole interesting like social elements to the controls of Mario, right? I just think that kind of thing is interesting, and like it's worth kind of expanding what we think is even a standard control scheme. If people have heard about this metaphor of flow to refer to like kind of a sense of optimal experience, a lot of what I'm kind of talking about and what a lot of games in general sort of like thrive on, I suppose, are being able to like toggle between extremes of anxiety and boredom. Flow is this kind of like sweet spot of experience where if a game is kind of too intense or too overwhelming, like there's too much information on the screen for people to coherently like navigate around it. I find various bullet hell games to be like this for me. They're very anxious if there's like too much going on that I can't even like parse like how to respond to it. Some people love that kind of thing. That kind of thing might work less for my brain. But that would be sort of like the upper edge of between flow and anxiety, right? And then boredom is a little bit like having something that's like not responsive enough. Like boredom would kind of be like, oh, if this, it can be as granular as game feel, but it can also be higher level. Like it could be as granular as game feel in the sense of like if something's too sluggish or like not responsive enough, that's sort of like an arena where we can dip from intrigue into boredom. But also then there's like kind of higher order ways of thinking about how games pace themselves and keep being interesting for people, where like making sure that people have enough like new and interesting ways to interface with your game so it's not just repetitive or the same kind of problem over and over again are like ways to keep people like above the threshold of boredom. So I'm going to briefly kind of conclude by sort of make sure I'm actually doing kind of okay on time. We can sort of like play around maybe like with the processing example in some of this next section. So like the thing that I'm gonna like, there's these like 4 stages of how we can think about the design of inputs, and the metaphor that gets used is attack, decay, sustain, release. These are sort of 4 stages of every input, and this isn't even necessarily like exclusive to like games or digital media. In fact, this structure. Moving between like these 4 stages of like modulated action. It actually comes from like acoustics. It comes from like musical theory and thinking about like the design of instruments. So if you think about like how a guitar sounds and how a guitar like physically works, there's the initial pluck, and the pluck is super responsive, right? You pluck a guitar string, immediately there's like probably like very quickly goes to like the peak of its sound. It has immediate feedback because it's like a physical thing. It's not implemented by a computer. And yeah, the like quote unquote attack or like the very beginning phase of this interaction is, it's like immediately responsive. There's no like delay. The decay is kind of like right past the peak. So like right after the guitar string has been plucked, there's this immediate kind of like just after the peak of the sound, there's like some phase where it kind of starts transitioning into becoming like a more prolonged note. For a little while, there's like some threshold of time, depending on like how much like force you pluck the string. There's like a period of time where, at least to our perception of sound, like a note will be kind of sustained for a little while by a guitar, and then it'll start falling off, right? It'll go into this kind of like release phase. And on a guitar, that can last for like a while. You know, that's part of like the beauty of the instrument. It's part of the like structure of how this thing physically works. But we can also think about how like we can model using this kind of scheme other kinds of instruments, right? Like this is more of like a pipe organ model. Like if you press a key on an organ or maybe a keyboard, right? Not so much a piano, which has strings and will behave differently, but like a digital keyboard, right? Like you press the button or you press a key and like immediately, similar to plucking the guitar, there's like an immediate response, right? But then that note will just kind of be sustained as long as you're holding it down. Like it'll just kind of keep going. The structure of this thing is such that it's tied, or the length of its, capacity to make sound is tied to your input like 1-to-1. And similarly, the release is immediate. Like you take your hand off the key of a digital keyboard or of a pipe organ, and it's like immediately gone. This just affords a different kind of music, right? There's not something better or worse. Like the guitar we're not going to make an argument that because the guitar can like be sustained for longer, that it's somehow superior to the pipe organ. These are just different kinds of tools for like an ensemble of music that you might be interested in composing. And so as designers, I kind of think that music metaphors map well onto the level of feel that I've been trying to talk about this whole time with game feel, because it's not really verbal and it's really hard to like represent in some kind of, semantic way. Like it's hard for me to just kind of give you, spell out explicitly in language how to make Mario springy, which is part of why I think that Swink has to rely so much on polish. Like there just being this iterative phase of like, well, I kind of just need to keep messing with the values until I get the response that I want. That's because these kinds of things aren't the kinds of things that are easily shareable between us in some kind of inscription. We just kind of have to play with it. So yeah, let's like think about this attack, decay, sustain, release structure in terms of like movement. Earlier we were talking about Mario's jump, so let's kind of return to that, or maybe even think a little bit about ways we could imagine the example that Arnpreet and I threw together differently, like if we were kind of building some kind of side-scrolling game from scratch ourselves. Some things we do want to be like immediate, right? Like we talked about how Mario's directional movement, whether or not he's looking left and right, that happens really quickly within that 10 frame per second threshold of perception. But when he actually starts moving, there's a little bit of buildup, I think, a little bit of momentum. It's not so binary like it is actually in our example, like there's a very flat speed. Like you press a button, you immediately start moving at like your top rate. Mario's acceleration takes a little bit of time. There's a little bit of tweening, a little bit of juice, right? Are there like side-scroller games that people particularly like playing? We can kind of break them down and throw them into this model and talk like more as a group, thinking through like how movement in some of our favorite games are implemented. Anybody have a side-scroller that they played kind of recently that they really like, or something that's just like a, from the same camera perspective at least, that Mario is in? Rebecca? Celeste. I was thinking about Celeste, yeah. Let's think about Celeste is wild, right? It's like a pretty, if people haven't played it, it's like a pretty strict game. It's also very like, it's very pretty. Like I like the visual style a lot. But how would you sort of describe the movement of Celeste if you can for us?
It's really particular, and I think it almost like goes between extremes because
it goes between extremes.
It's
yeah.
very responsive in terms of like you can change your like direction mid jump and everything. But on the other hand, when you dash, it's like one like definitive movement, but you can't like change while it's happening.
Yeah, great. So this is useful for a few reasons. Maybe we can think about the transition of moving a character from left to right on a screen. And then there's a dash button. So like in Celeste, there's like, if I remember correctly, I don't think you can cancel the dash. Like I think it's like there's a set, like when you press the button and you're going in a direction, you move like that amount. And that is the amount that you move and you're committed to that, right? And that unfolds with some animation lock over like a little bit of time. And sort of the art of playing Celeste, I guess, would be just about trying to like balance that movement in a relatively frenetic environment where it's very easy to like fall to your death at the bottom of the screen, but there's a lot of obstacles like on the screen that you're kind of trying to jump between and around to keep your character in the air. But yeah, like that, how would we maybe want to kind of characterize like this arc of like for a game that's kind of, we want people to feel like intense, right? I think that it, like Celeste, has a certain kind of audience. Like I think it's going for a certain like kind of precision of play. So yeah, let's start moving a character like that. What would the ramp between like input and movement look like for like the starting phase, like the attack chunk of this sort of chart? Someone like with their hand sort of do it for me. Is it kind of like shaped like this maybe, or is it shaped like this? You know what I mean? Like, is there a fall off before you start getting to like your peak movement?
Do you mean for like the normal movement or the dash?
Yeah, let's start with normal movement and then we're going to get to the dash. So starting from like when you start moving your character, what would sort of like the initial arc kind of look like?
I feel like it's kind of like this.
Okay, so it's a pretty quick ramp.
She just starts running and then it gets faster.
Okay, so maybe it's in the direction of the pipe organ. You know what I mean? Where the pipe organ example is like there's just kind of like this quick, immediate response. There are a few different kinds of games that are platformery like this that have, I think, different implementations. Like I'm realizing what's coming to mind right now, like have people played Super Meat Boy? A few people have. So yeah, that's a game that I would say is like similarly intense, and one of the reasons why it's intense is that there's a lot of kind of like the Ink character we were talking about at the top of class in Super Smash Bros. That character's slippery, right? Like that character kind of slides around the screen, and having to control that in a way that like where there's a lot of obstacles and a lot of like opportunities for failure, that character still I think has like a similar ramp up to Celeste, but Celeste has a lot more friction. You know what I mean by that? Like Celeste is responsive in a way where there's a lot more capacity for control. Contrasting those two things for now, like people who have played both games, or you know, who at least know what I'm talking about with maybe played analogous games, what's the sort of emotional effect contrasting like when we start getting to this like sustained place, like where movement is at its peak? We've kind of initially started a character moving, and now they're like in their peak speed. But in one game, we can rely on like the friction of the character to like be pretty fully within our control. And in another game, we know that the character is going to like slip when we stop, when we kind of let go of this. What's the different feeling there? Like, can people kind of describe it for me? Anybody? Rebecca, what do you think?
Well, I feel like that kind of effect is the main reason why Super Meat Boy is so much more like angering or frustrating than Celeste.
Fascinating. Meat Boy is more infuriating than Celeste. Okay, yeah.
Because like in Celeste, when you stop putting the input to go forward, she just stops.
Yeah.
It's not that much of like a slide. In Super Meat Boy, it's like the exact opposite.
Yeah.
So then it's like kind of like the frustration of you have some amount of control, but not fully in Super Meat Boy.
Yeah.
Because
So,
like
yeah.
at a certain point, you are just out of control, and that's where it like gets like upsetting.
Totally. So yeah, I think you've hit the money. You've hit the mark. So like it, Celeste affords more control, and so there's something sort of I don't know, like less anxious about the sort of like peak of sustained movement. So now we have, I think, pretty different looking fall offs to these two kinds of games because of how the amount of friction that these characters have. Like they're similar kinds of games, but like, can we think about if one character is more slippery and one character is more rigid? What does the like shape of the release phase, the back end of this kind of chart look like? Can someone like draw it for me with their hands or verbally describe something for me? Character that's slipperier versus a character that like has more friction. Yeah, Rebecca, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess for Celeste, it's kind of like more like this sort of deal.
Yeah, there'd be kind of a rounded fall off
Yeah, kind of
for
like a
Celeste.
fall-off.
Yeah,
With Meat Boy, it's straight up just like
Totally.
More like a gradient.
totally. Yeah, like with Meat Boy, it's a little bit closer to that like guitar string fall off. The guitar string fall off being like this kind of a longer tail for how long the guitar string lasts. There's actually a few examples that we have here. So yeah, let's sort of there's a few different like images here about like what kind of movement corresponds with like what kinds of response. So like maybe that Ink character that we talked about toward the beginning, I actually don't know how that character's movement might end. But if I understood from the description, there's kind of a longer time before when you can kind of like ramp up movement with that character. Like you hold down, let's say there's paint on the ground, the character's slipping around. Maybe there's a little bit of a buildup or like something that's shaped more like this for the sort of attack phase of that. Like you have to hold down the button for 0.5 seconds before you really start getting moving. Maybe it's probably longer than that. Maybe it's even close to a full second. I'm not actually sure, but certainly it's within that threshold, because otherwise we would kind of start having to deal with like, there's a difference between something that needs a like longer ramp up and something that feels sluggish, like somehow with that character that sort of intentional design works, right? So there's something that has like a longer tail. Maybe this is a little bit closer to like the Meat Boy feeling. Do people agree with that? This idea that if we have a character that when they stop moving, they kind of slide. Do people kind of see how like the back end of this, maybe the tail should be longer. Maybe the release window needs to be kind of like further out. But I think loosely this is the sort of shape for that kind of game. Yeah, let's see. This was sort of like where I was kind of curious, like this kind of twitchy response. Because anybody played a game recently where they felt like, I kind of want to contrast two examples, like one time where people felt like that the twitch responsiveness of the game really worked for what that game was going for, and one time where maybe it tipped a little too far into anxiety, because that's you guys remember that flow chart that I talked about? There's like this sweet middle spot where things feel good, and then things can dip either too high up into anxiety or too far down into boredom. So twitchiness is where we're kind of at the upper threshold of that kind of chart, right? Anybody have examples of like times where twitch responsiveness was like, oh, this is juicy, this is great, I love this, and times where twitch responsiveness was like, I'm having trouble controlling the character? Anyone have something like that recently? Doesn't even need to be video games if you had like a similar or a similar experience in a different kind of media. Yeah.
Not super recently, but I was playing Bloodborne.
Bloodborne. Okay. Yeah. Tell us about how Twitch and Bloodborne.
So like this would be my first time playing because I don't have a console. I'm using someone else's console, right?
Yeah. Borrowing a friend's console. Mm-hmm.
So I'm going into like this cave
Mm-hmm.
system, and it's not until I get jumped do I realize that there are guardians in there.
Yeah. Okay. So you walked into this cave and you weren't sure what was in it, and then like suddenly you're surrounded by dudes, right? Yeah. Okay.
And then that's when I have like the craziest twitch reaction. Like, oh my god!
Yeah. You can backstep in that game, right? Is that what you did, or how'd you get out of that?
I ended up immediately fighting.
Okay. You just went into it and you fought. Yeah.
And I think actually that was right at the line crossing between anxiety and like, oh, this feels good.
Yeah.
I think this is like unrelated to Twitch, the Twitch, because the guardians look creepy. So like
Sure.
pushed into more anxiety, right?
Yeah.
But like, had that not been a factor, I think it was really juicy. It was really good, and it leaned more towards that than just the anxiety.
Yeah. So the kind of intensity of that like, oh crap moment was still within the realm of pleasure. Like it wasn't like overwhelming to the point where you were like, oh my god, I can't do this, because there was something about the fact that you could respond to it by just like immediately recognizing without having to being able to plan ahead, really, like I'm about to be attacked, and then you just kind of leap into a more like ferocious, aggressive combat style. What I'm hearing you saying, I think the beginning phase of that, I think it's shaped like this. Does that make sense to you? Do you agree with me? Where like there's this kind of quick like ramp up of the attack? Yeah. Because like the reason why I think maybe for Bloodborne, just because I'm familiar with that game, could make an argument that it's closer to this, like that what you're describing is this like immediate responsiveness. But earlier I talked about how game made by the same company, Dark Souls. I'm actually not sure if this is like the best example, this kind of section to describe Dark Souls, but Dark Souls involves being really kind of committed to an attack. It's probably more like this. Like when you start trying to attack in that game, there's like a while between like when you press, an anxious amount of time between when you press the button to attack and when your attack actually goes through. And in Bloodborne, same company, more or less a spiritual successor to Dark Souls, the game's much faster paced. Like the movement is more ferocious, more intense. The story involves like there being these like people are kind of turning into werewolves, and there's this whole theme of like there's like a beast inside of you. There's an aggressiveness, and that I think comes out in the game feel, right? Because like what we're talking about might be a little bit closer to this kind of shape of responsiveness. And I recognize I'm talking about games that maybe not everybody here has played or what you're familiar with, but the point that I'm trying to get at with this contrast is that there's an emotional difference between a startup attack in Dark Souls and a startup attack in Bloodborne, and that this is not, I mean, here's where me being like a literary student comes into play. Like, this isn't just like user experience, palpable interaction design stuff. It kind of tells you something about the story of the world, right? Like the feeling of being one character in Dark Souls is like you're in this heavy armor. The world is like sluggish and depressed, and you're kind of like persevering in spite of it. And the world of Bloodborne is like ferocious and dark, and you have to like aggressively kind of meet it. And that is something that I think is baked into the nitty-gritty interaction design of these games. Like, you can actually communicate world, you can communicate character. There's all sorts of kinds of things that you can convey with like using different game feels. This one might be a little bit older than people here would have been familiar with. Like, I kind of started being, when I was in college, like the, maybe even kind of late high school, the, what kind of gets referred to these days as like the indie game revolution started kicking off, where games on the Xbox Live marketplace that were like made by small developers were able to like make some serious money. And one of the games that came soon after that, like not immediately, but like a few years into it, was a really cute little game by a developer and sound designer named Tom Bissell called Thomas Was Alone. Anybody ever heard of Thomas Was Alone? One person? Yeah, so like, I'm gonna pick on you, I'm sorry. So the Thomas Is Alone is like, my interpretation of the story is that it's a story about the first sentient bit of data, like in a computer is what I think is going on there. There's a little rectangle named Thomas, and he's just a little red rectangle, and he can move around the screen, not unlike the little processing example that Arnpreet and I have. And Thomas starts off being alone. It's told as if it's kind of a storybook. But then Thomas meets other friends. Thomas, as he kind of goes through his little adventure, finds other differently shaped squares. Do you remember any of the other characters in Thomas Was Alone, by any chance? You don't need to remember their names, but do you remember their colors? Do you remember like what they did?
No, I mean, I remember that there was like, I know there was a yellow one.
There was a yellow one, yeah, okay. Do you remember because you get to play all these different characters. I think he was really tall, right? And gendered he for reasons that are confusing. It's just like this really long stick of a character, like a really big rectangle. He's really thin, he's really tall. Do you remember how he moved?
It was kind of like, I don't know, he had like a high jump, I think.
He had a really high jump, yeah. That was the sort of like gimmick of Thomas Was Alone, was that like each character controlled a little bit differently, and each character's personality was like in their movement. And I think I remember this character was like, he's lanky, he's kind of shy, but he's like really tall and he can get you places. He's very like friendly and helpful, right? This is like a game that's kind of intended to be sort of like storybooky for kids. But in the design of this character, like what this character can do, right? Like even it's literally just a rectangle on a screen. There's this contrast with Thomas, and that behavior like tells you something about the character's personality. We can actually kind of tell stories or make characters with the like way that they move. There's another character in that one named Claire, I think. She's like a big blocky square. And she's really slow moving. Like you kind of start moving her and like the responsiveness is relatively quick, but she drags. Like she does not move as fast as any other characters. She needs a little bit of help getting around. But she has a kind of superpower, is what they say in the game. She's the only character that can float in water. So like you can switch between controlling these characters and get Claire to kind of get into the water. And you can have all of her friends kind of climb on top of her and she'll sort of ferry them across the water, right? So the point being that like the fact that we have these, it's like weird that we have these kinds of affiliations, right? Like between, like I'm not sure if you guys really catch my drift here, but I do think it's interesting that based on how quickly a character even moves, we can kind of attribute personality to them if the game is framing that right. Can we invent a character together in the last few minutes of class? Let's say we want something that is really quick moving, springy, twitchy, dynamic. What's that personality like? It's a weird question, but I think as creatives, it's interesting to think about, right? Let's translate movement into personality. Come on, y'all are visual artists. Give me something. I can see that you're thinking. Yeah.
No.
You're not thinking?
Trying.
Head empty, no thoughts? Rebecca, what do you think?
Wait, okay, you said like twitchy and springy, right?
Springy, yeah.
That kind of gives me like the mental image of like someone who's kind of like short and like skinny
Sure.
Kind of like wild hair.
Okay,
we
like
were
that.
ha, 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 ha,
Okay,
ha,
okay,
ha.
okay. So like Sonic-y maybe. Yeah, so like twitchy, responsive, fast-moving. So yeah, what do you think like that? What do you think that character might like? I don't know. Personality-wise, like are they introverted? Are they extroverted? Like what do you think?
Yeah, definitely extrovert.
Definitely an extrovert.
Maybe
Yeah.
talks a lot.
Probably talks too much.
Yeah.
I wouldn't know the type. Yeah, totally. But I do think it's interesting that we can do that. Do people kind of know what I'm saying here? Do people kind of understand like how you can make character with these things? Like I think that's kind of a weird, interesting angle that you could take your own work. Yeah.
You could also like think about it in an animation sense, like if
Uh-huh.
you're seeing this character on screen,
Yeah.
this cartoonish character, and then moving a certain way. Well, then you want to transfer that into your game when
Yeah.
you're characterizing or developing character.
Yeah, and you might even, if you're thinking about it as a designer, like let's say you have a character with these personalities, the writing team has done that work or whatever. There's visual assets in place for you. But now you need to create problems that character is maybe like more fit to solve. That's like an interesting kind of way of thinking about, yeah, like kind of pushing the sense of character by bleeding it into design. Like, let's say that you have a character that's kind of faster moving than the others. What's the sort of goal you might give that character that you wouldn't give to others? Do you have anything off the top of your head? Okay, sure. I don't know. It could involve like timed movement. It could involve like something as closing, right? Like maybe there's like they need a gap needs to be traversed that's like widening. Maybe that character can like fling themselves further or something to that effect. But yeah, like I'm not sure if this is exactly the kind of thing that folks in this room might want to make for like let's say final projects or whatever. It's like that's pretty sophisticated. But I do think it's interesting to think about the different modes of meaning you can make with game feel, like with interaction design. We only have like a few minutes left here, and I've kind of gotten to like most of what I was interested in discussing. Is there anything that people like could use a little bit more help understanding here, or do you want me to play more with the example? Anything else that we want to kind of discuss before we wrap up for the day? Anything about game feel that people are sort of like still chewing on? Not really sure how they translate it into processing, for instance, like in terms of responsiveness. Okay, well, know that Armpreet and I are around to like play with whatever it is you guys are making if you were interested in trying to implement some of these ideas. I'll make sure the slides are available so people can have like those references that I pointed folks to, like that video I do think is like quite useful. Juice it or lose it if you're interested in like trying to animate your avatars or whatever it is that you're controlling in ways where they can have a sense of a little bit more dynamic movement, right? Like the example that I really liked from that is like when they're moving the paddle on the Pong or whatever it is, brick breaker, moving the paddle back and forth, it kind of like gets a little bit shorter, a little bit slimmer while it's moving. So it kind of has this like stretchy, bouncy feel. So yeah, thanks for coming, folks. Hope that this was like an interesting, a little bit more like creative way to think about the kind of stuff that you can make. Let me know if you have any questions, and take care.